Hello everyone, welcome back to PolicyPulse by Rauf. Today we dive into a topic many think is old news, public debt. But believe me, it's creeping up on us again, and the stakes are high. We're going to explore why the world is worrying about public debt again, how the regulatory and financing architecture is shifting, why developing and developed countries are under pressure, and why you should care. Now, what's changed since the last debt scare? And more importantly, can governments keep borrowing without paying the price? Let's begin with the big picture. According to the International Monetary Fund, IMF, total global debt, public plus private, remains at around 235% of world GDP, about $251 trillion in 2024. Of that, public government debt has risen to nearly 93% of global GDP. Because high debt relative to GDP means governments may struggle to service what they own, especially when growth is weak or interest rates rise. Let's look at some developed countries. For example, Japan, government debt is about 205% of GDP, Italy, around 131.7% of GDP, United States, about 112.26% of GDP. These are countries with large economies, deep financial markets, and often the ability to borrow in their own currency. Question: does that make them safe from a debt crisis? Not entirely, because high debt means higher interest payments, less fiscal space to respond to shocks, and regulatory legal frameworks that may lag the risk. Now, turn to emerging and developing economies. The debt ratios may not always be as high as 200%, but the risks can be greater because of weaker institutions, currency risk, external debt exposure, and less room for maneuver. For example, the Sudan tops global charts with public debt at around 252% of GDP. And according to the World Bank, low and middle-income countries' external debt stock rose by $205.9 billion in 2023 alone. Question: what happens when interest rates spike or currencies depreciate in these countries? Often, the servicing cost explodes, turning manageable debt into crisis. Why is public debt climbing? Several factors. Weak economic growth. The IMF projects global GDP growth of only 2.8% this year. Higher interest rates and increased borrowing costs. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, notes interest payments to GDP in many OECD countries hit 3.3% in 2024, up from the year before. On the regulation side, many governments expanded during the pandemic, created new borrowing channels, and now face a built-in rollover risk. Maturing debt must be refinanced at higher cost. Question: what role do international lenders and regulation play in this dynamic? They set the tone, provide lending with conditions, and regulate what governments can or cannot do, yet the incentives for debt accumulation often outpace regulations. In the developing world, the interplay between sovereign borrowers and international lenders, multilaterals, bilateral lenders, bond markets, matters a lot. The World Bank debt statistics show that debt transparency is still inadequate, and external debt burdens keep rising. Legal regulatory frameworks in many borrower countries are weak, limited disclosures, little independent oversight of borrowing decisions, and weak contract enforcement. Question: could weaker law regulation mean higher risk of default or restructuring? Yes, countries with weaker frameworks may face higher interest margins, fewer lender options, and greater risk of abrupt stops or restructurings. Let's talk about leakages and institutional weakness. Governments may borrow to cover deficits, invest in non-productive spending, or bail out firms, but without growth, the debt burden increases faster than the economy. In many emerging economies, weak tax systems, corruption, off-balance sheet liabilities, local government borrowings hidden from central accounts, all of this aggravates risk. Question: what happens when debts pile up and growth stalls? Potential outcome: Debt servicing crowds out everything else: investment, social spending, infrastructure, eroding growth further, trapping the economy in a vicious cycle. Developed countries may seem safer, but they have risks too. High aging populations, pensions, health, defense and climate transition spending, and large inherited debt burdens. The IMF warned that global public debt could reach nearly 100% of global GDP by 2030. Question: what would it mean if major economies face a fiscal shock while already heavily indebted? It could mean sharper austerity, higher taxes, inflation pressures, or even market instability, which could ripple into global trade and finance. So, how are regulatory bodies responding? Governments and multilateral lenders are pushing for better debt transparency, loan-by-loan data, via the World Bank's debt reporting system, medium-term fiscal frameworks specifying how much new borrowing is permissible relative to GDP and growth. Question: can regulation alone solve the debt problem? No, regulation helps, but if growth is weak and interest rates are high, the structural problem remains. Legal frameworks must be backed by credible policy and enforcement. Now you might ask, why does all this matter to me? Because public debt affects tax burdens, inflation, interest rates, employment, and trade. If debt service rises, governments may cut back on public investment, social programs, or increase taxes. Question: what if a debt crisis in a major emerging economy triggers global spillovers? Then we could see currency volatility, sharp capital outflows, trade disruptions, things that touch all of us in the globalized economy. Let's summarize the key takeaways. Global public debt is high, 90–100% of GDP globally, and rising. Developed economies carry very high debt-to-GDP ratios. Japan 205%, US 112%. Emerging developing economies face greater risk due to weaker institutions, external debt and currency risk. Legal regulatory frameworks matter: transparency, contract enforcement, borrowing limits. The interplay of weak growth, plus rising interest costs, plus structural deficits. A dangerous mix. If you think this is just remote theory, think again. The next fiscal shock anywhere could ripple everywhere. So, what should you watch for? Borrowing announcements and new debt issuance by governments, changes in debt servicing cost and interest payment share of budgets, external debt exposures and currency mismatches, regulatory reforms, or lack thereof, in borrower countries, global trade shocks, protectionism and growth slowdowns. Thanks for watching this episode of PolicyPulse by Rauf. If you found this deep dive useful, make sure you subscribe, hit the like button, and share this video so you and your network stay ahead of the curve, because when debt risks rise, everyone pays. See you in the next episode, highlighting different issue.